I want to welcome everybody on behalf of New York University's Center for the Humanities. I'm Uli Bear, I'm the director of the center, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome colleagues and friends who've participated in so many events over the years. So it's really wonderful to see all of you. And I want to thank the audience for making time today. This is one of the last events of our academic semester. So wherever you are, in whatever time zone you're in, thank you so much. We're really excited to host this event on melancholy in politics, literature, and philosophy. So I'll hand it over to Mikhal. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And I really look forward to this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Uli. And also thank you, Tzvi Ben-Dor Benit, for coming up with the idea of this panel and for hosting this panel at the Humanities Center. So as Uli said, I'm a professor of English and comparative literature at the City College of New York. And I also direct our own Humanities Center at City College, the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and Arts. I was going to start by saying I look forward to future collaboration and invite all of you to come up to our center. But what does coming up even mean these days? You know, for now we are just always in the same place, same as it ever was, as the great David Byrne says. And but that won't last forever. So I look forward to more events like this in both our institutions. In 2011, I published a book that looked at what Raymond Williams calls the structure of feeling of early Zionist works. So these were works of prose and poetry that were written at the late 19th century and early 20th century, so decades before the establishment of the state of Israel, but also in the shadow of violent pogroms of the late 19th century and early 20th century. These were not works that were overtly or overtly nationalistic or assertive, rather they were melancholic both in content and in form. And I focused on the transformation of melancholy to tragedy in that case. And I was very curious about how these works, which are overtly melancholic, still manage to mobilize readers into political action. Since that was 10 years ago, and since then, there's been a lot of work, obviously, in melancholy, and we have some of the best thinkers about melancholy in just right here with us. And I'm thrilled to hear what they say about melancholy and the public sphere. So I'm going to introduce our speakers by the order of appearance, and then they will give their papers in succession. Each paper will be about 20 minutes. And afterwards, we will have a discussion. Please write your questions in the Q&A. I will try to get to as many of them as we have time for. So Nitzan Lebovic, who is will be our first speaker, is professor of history and Apter Chair of Holocaust Studies and Ethical Values at Lehigh University. He is the author of The Philosophy of Life and Death, Ludwig Klages and the Rise of a Nazi Biopolitics from 2013. And of course, a subject close to my heart, a great book, Zionism and Melancholy, The Short Life of Israel Zarchi in Hebrew, which was published in 2015 in Hebrew and 2019 in English. Nitzan is also a co-editor of The Politics of Nihilism and of Catastrophes, a history and theory of an operative concept from 2014. And he's also co-editor of multiple special journal issues, which, you know, the list is too long to cite here. Vivian Liska, our next speaker after Nitzan, is a professor of German literature and director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp. Since 2013, she has served as a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She has published extensively on literary theory, German modernism, and German Jewish authors and thinkers. Her most recent books, and just her most recent, because she has quite a few of them, are When Kafka Says We, on Common Communities in German Jewish Literature from 2009, Fremde Gemeinschaft from 2011, and After Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, a tenuous legacy from 2017. Vivian is currently working on a book on new beginnings. Rebecca Comay teaches in the philosophy department and the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto, where she's also cross-appointed to the Jewish Studies program, the German department, and the program in Literature and Critical Theory. And you have to excuse the barking of my dog. I hope you can hear me. I'll shut him up in a minute. Rebecca has published widely on continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, literary theory, and contemporary art. Her books include Morning Sickness, Hegel and the French Revolution from 2011, and co-authored with Frank Ruda, The Dash, The Other Side of Absolute Knowing from 2017. Rebecca is currently working on 2 book projects, a book on the temporality of deadlines, and another book called Dramaturgy of the Dialectic. Nitzan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mikhal. Thank you, the NYU Center, of course, for the Humanities, and especially Kayla Bowen, who's organized this amazing event. Uli Bear, of course, the director, and Zvi Ben-Dor-Benit, who organized and initiated the event. And of course, to the audience, a lot of people who join us today and join us instead of other events, multiple events I know that are taking place now, currently 2 hours. My own favorite would have been a live concert by Mitsuko Ushida, but I won't share the details here. In the coming minutes, I'll follow the footsteps of giants, not necessarily melancholic giants, but giants who wrote about melancholy. 3 of them are actually my co-panelists, share my view here, my screen. And speaking of sharing the screen, let me share mine. There we go. So what I'd like to do is shortly talk about the definition of melancholy as a way of introducing the topic, trying to help also my co-panelists to step from here, from Freud and up to Kristeva, say a few words about the historical background, following a pretty cross, and expected periodization between the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. Try to narrow that down into a more specific political discussion of the politics of melancholy, specifically left-wing melancholy, and even more specifically in the context of the history of Zionism, which I wrote about and that interests me, and then reopen the scope and actually discuss political melancholy as a trope in a more general form. And let's start with a definition. So when Freud talks about melancholy, first as a draft in 1915, of course, with the First World War in the background, and then the published text, the full text in 1917, this is how he defines that. And of course, this is a very partial definition. Melancholy is a reaction to the loss of a loved person or to the loss of some obstruction which has taken the place of one, such as one's country, liberty, an idea, and so on. And he continues to say, the melancholic displays something which is lacking in mourning, an extraordinary diminution in his self-regard and impoverishment of his ego on a grand scale. In mourning, and Freud, of course, contrasts the two, mourning and melancholy. In mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. And when we talk about melancholy, of course, when Freud talks about melancholy, he talks about a history of melancholy, not just a melancholy as an analytical concept, but one that carries a whole baggage, civilizatory baggage with it, that takes us all the way back to, of course, Aristotle and Homer, or Homer and Aristotle, to be more precise. And that brings us to Kristeva's understanding, definition of melancholy, using the imagery, the metaphors taken from Homer, speaking about the Iliad. So the Iliad gave us in Bellerophon the melancholic's tendency to self-pity, and she quotes, "Forsaken by the gods, exiled by divine decree, this desperate man was condemned not to mania, but to banishment. And the theory she develops out of it characterizes melancholy in the following terms, and that's the bottom: a denial of loss, so a double loss, a loss of a loss, the denial of loss belongs to a world devoid of signifiers, self-referentiality brought close to narcissism and to fetishism. Now, going back again, or rather anchoring that in the ancient world and the etymology of melancholia, Giorgio Agamben gave in stanzas a very succinct depiction of melancholy and its, again, what I call baggage, but its legacy really for Western civilization. And he depicts that in the following terms: its planet, the planet of melancholy, is Saturn, among whose children the melancholic finds himself with the hanged man, the cripple, the peasant, the gambler. The physiological syndrome of the abundatia melancholia, abundance of melancholy humor, or known as black bile, includes darkening of the skin, blood and urine, hardening of the pulse, burning in the gut, flatulence, avid burping, whistling in the left ear, constipation or excess of feces, and gloomy dreams. Of course, if you have any of those now, you know what's the reason, yeah? If you suffer from any of those. Among the diseases it can include are hysteria, dementia, epilepsy, leprosy, hemorrhoids, scabies, and suicidal mania. The melancholic is paxima complexionatus, worse complexion, sad, envious, malevolent, avid, fraudulent, cowardly, and earthly. Yeah. So not a very positive prospect for the melancholic, we could say. But on the other hand, and that's Aristotle's depiction of it, also something that actually opens a scope, opens a gate or a potential for the unexpected, the alternative world that doesn't follow certain norms, and therefore during the Romantic period leads us into the understanding of the genius as a melancholic person who might suffer from all these pathologies or problems, physical problems. Moving on to the Middle Ages and modernity. During the Middle Ages, Panofsky and Zaxel, the two historians of Melancholy in Saturn and Melancholy, published in 1923, tell us, during the Middle Ages, the melancholy gaze was compared to, quote, the look of a mad dog, la chien rage, usually black dog, and, quote, the impression of the night. And later they talk about melancholy. Melancholy was psychologized and personified. Now, this work itself, Panofsky and Zaxel, was then adapted by Walter Benjamin in his Trauerspiel, but in other, we can see traces of that appearing in other works as well. The Trauerspiel, the draft was completed submitted as his postdoc in 1925, Habilitation, published in 1928, where he depicts melancholy as a liminal threshold, a liminal threshold. The paradigmatic melancholic figure of the time was, for that very reason, he writes, the figure of the prince, or rather a beastly prince. And that's a quote from Benjamin: nothing demonstrates the frailty of the creaturely so drastically as the fact that even he is subject to melancholy. Melancholy, in other terms, is a liminal threshold that is, or that we can expect to transgress between the man and the animal, between human being and the subhuman, or sometimes, as Benjamin shows us, the superhuman or the divine, a certain divine voice. More specifically, Benjamin is continuing to think about melancholy as not just as a typology, we can say, of sovereignty, but as a specific political appearance. And that leads him in 1931 to the left-wing, his article about left-wing melancholy. And at that point, I want to take a short break from that Western civilization kind of grand narrative and say 2 words about what interests me in that and where I find this topic and that history relevant to our own day. When I researched the appearance of melancholy in Zionist history and history of Zionism, I thought about it first and foremost as a type of left-wing melancholy, with and without Benjamin's understanding of that term. The reason was actually historical. As a historian, I was interested first and foremost in the social democratic understanding of the ideological social democratic appearance of melancholy, or the way it served within Zionism during the early years of the Yishuv as a type of, as a typical affect. And historians, I can say more about it later if anyone is interested, historians of Zionism, specifically historians of medicine, are talking about melancholy, or as we would call it today, maybe even depression, as one of the most common affects and least spoken of affects during the early years of the Yishuv. Eran Rolnik, one of them, is mentioning the fact that during the first years of Zionist settlements, pioneers, the rate of the suicide rate among pioneers was above 10%, which is inconceivable. Now, that of course was even further radicalized after the Holocaust, and is identified, of course, with the post-Holocaust period of silence and trauma, the language of trauma, and so on and so forth. Historians of Zionism, again, such as, or the literature of Zionism, such as Alan Mintz and Yael Zubavel, are talking about Zionist discourse as full with apocalyptic images during that period, images of destruction that embedded the understanding of Zionist discourse in a melancholic language. Amnon Raz-Karkutzkin, the historian, is talking about the negation of exile, the phenomena of the negation of exile that is typical to Zionism in the following terms. And he anchors that specifically with how Zionism understood exile as a loss, and as we'll see, moving into a double loss, because of course, the pioneers lost their language, their culture, their background, their families, but were not allowed to speak about them, were not allowed to actually mourn that loss. Hence, once an actual loss of the object, and then the loss of the ability to discuss or analyze or integrate that object. So a double loss. And Raz-Karkutzkin is talking about exile in the following terms. Exile in Zionism is a condition of deficient existence, partial and abnormal, hence something that should be understood within the Zionist discourse as shameful and illegitimate. And so far, that brings us into how that grand history again of melancholy in Western civilization is translating into a specific political set of circumstances. But I want to narrow our vision even further and move into a closer look at left-wing melancholy. So Alan Mintz in Mourning in Hebrew Literature in 1984 is talking about the socialist Zionist education, which called for a substantial transevaluation of Jewish life, but emphasized apocalyptic threats and Zionist ideology as a solution. And that brings me to the protagonist of my own book, In Zionism and Melancholy, Israel Zarchi, who Mikhal mentioned. Thank you, Mikhal. And I'm not going to say much about him here. If anyone is interested about left-wing melancholy in Zionism or in Zarchi's biography, you're invited, of course, to take a look at the book. I'll just say the following to give us, again, supplies with a certain background to understand the relevance. So Zarchi was born in 1909 in Jędrzejów in Poland, died in 1947. You can see the dates here above. And someone who spoke, of course, fluent Polish, learned in a Jewish cheder, so came from traditional background in Judaism, Jewish traditional background, learned German, was fluent in German, and then learned English and became the first translator of Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas to Hebrew. In my eyes, still the best translation. Translated Joseph Conrad from English, of course, to Hebrew, Janusz Korczak and others. was interested in Ernst Toller and other interesting figures, all of which belong, you'll notice, more or less to what we identify nowadays with a critical voice, specifically of the left. He published 6 novels and 7 collections of short stories, all of which were completely erased from the pages of Hebrew, the history of Hebrew literature. The reason was because all these novels and short stories, all but one, and I can say more about the one if you're interested, all but the last one were dealing with a failure of pioneers or the failure of settlement in Palestine, and depicted specifically the core of what I'd like to argue is the focus here of left-wing melancholy and even political melancholy, and that is the gap between ideal and realization. All these stories depict protagonists who come with this idealistic language to settle in the land, experience hardships, and then fail to realize their ideal. The interesting factor is, and that's where his skill as a literary writer, I think, shows, is that the language fails with them. So we see a collapse of both the physical and the political language, as well as the language of description itself, the ability to actually relate to the surrounding, to the environment. Now, following that, his critics, the very few critics, there were maybe 3 or 4 during the 1930s and 1940s who even paid attention to his literature, talked about the literature for these reasons as, and I'll use just one example, but an important one by Yosef Klausner, Amos Oz's great uncle, who called Zalchi's literature a state of imperfectum in his eulogy after Zalchi's death. And imperfectum because for Klausner, again, the ideal or the idealistic language that Zalchi spoke, or he allowed his protagonists to speak, kept failing. And for Klausner, that was inconceivable. There was something that actually projected back again about the literary product itself, not the language of the protagonist or not the discourse they were speaking. Now, so far about the critics. On Zalchi's end, it's interesting to know that he knew Freud very well. He actually called Freud in his diaries and letters Rabbi Freud, and he depicted himself in the diaries. I was very happy when I found that smoking gun, we can call it so. He identified himself with Fabian, Erich Kästner's protagonist. Now, those of you who know Walter Benjamin's Left-Wing Melancholy, Walter Benjamin mentions Fabian as the prototypical protagonist of a left-wing melancholy. So that's the prototypical protagonist for the theory, this understanding of social democratic left-wing melancholy. Zalchi indeed belonged to a moderate left wing. The only depiction of him during that period that I know of, a longer one by another author, refers to his fight with the representative of Messianic politics, Zionist Messianic politics, right-wing revisionist ideologue called Uri Tzvi Greenberg. And this other author depicts the fight they have, the conflict they have, about no other than about Sigmund Freud. So the two actually clash about whether Freud is relevant or irrelevant to their understanding of Zionism and the world. I'll end this short, again, depiction here, and I'll move to my conclusion. And the conclusion has 2 short parts, very quick one, very brief one. One is just mentioning briefly that those of you who know Amos Oz and read A Story of Love and Darkness would actually come to the other longer depiction of Zalchi as a protagonist in Amos Oz's Story of Love and Darkness. Oz's father was a very close friend of Zalchi. That after the family experienced hardship, they moved into Zalchi's house. They lived with them. Zalchi babysitted Oz, and Oz came to identify in Zalchi his literary ideal as a man who invented stories out of his head. But Oz is also known as someone who actually developed that notion of left-wing melancholy in what became known as the shooting and crime slogan, in a book of interviews he's done with Avraham Shapira in 1967. I see Mikhal coming up, so I guess my time is about to end. So I'm not going to read the quotes here from In the Land of Israel in 1983. You can see they depict a state of left-wing melancholy, I think, in a very characteristic language to both Oz and this culture of shooting and crying as we came to know it. And I'll move to my conclusion. So left-wing melancholy, when we talk about left-wing melancholy, I think the definition Wendy Brown gave it in 1999 could be helpful. It is a left that has become more attached to its impossibility than to its potential fruitfulness. It is caught in the structure of melancholic attachment to a strain of its own dead past. And more recently, in the last few years, we've seen a series of giants, as I mentioned, writing about these topics, people such as Enzo Traverso, Roberto Esposito, Rebecca Comay, who's here, Julia Kristeva, who I mentioned, and Judith Butler, among others. And I want to end by reopening the issue or the topic, this political affect of left-wing melancholy, to a bigger or larger framework that I called here political melancholy, which I identify in historical terms as a seminal realization of collective loss that hinders a given group's ability to affect change, in textual or philosophical terms as a state that shows us about one being trapped in a gap or a threshold between ideal and realization. In temporal terms, this is a state of suspense or repetition. In spatial terms, this is a loss, shows us a loss of direction. If you remember Julia Kristeva's definition from early on. And in political terms, the transforming of the political mode from struggle or solidarity into a fetishistic loyalty to objects, or from means and mechanisms to products and symbolic profit, that is, again, a failure to introduce a change into the world. With that, I'll stop, and I hope that will serve our next speakers, again, giants on their own right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nitzan, and we'll move on to Vivian.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Do you see my shared screen as well? Okay, thank you. My text is called Melancholy in the Circus, Kafka's Up in the Gallery. Franz Kafka has frequently been called a prophet of all the ailments and catastrophes of the 20th century. Given that he has rarely been associated with either revolution or melancholy, it might sound far-fetched to add to the list of his established prophecies and call him a visionary of a post-revolutionary melancholy, the condition Enzo Traverso has diagnosed as the state of the left in our own time. Had you not invited me to this event and asked me to reflect on melancholy as literary practice in the public sphere, dear Nitzan, I might not have realized this myself. Your generous encouragement to indulge in my compulsion for close readings emboldened me to base myself on a single short text to make the wild claim that Kafka points not only to the melancholic aftermath of a failed revolution, but to the possibility of performing in and through literature the preconditions for an alternative to both the status quo and its violent interruption. The failure to intervene is a recurrent motif in Kafka's work, as a striking pattern shows in these examples. Is it too small or can you see it?
We can see it.
I try to make it bigger.
I think it's fine. Don't worry about it, Vivian.
So what you get here, and I'm not going to read them because it would take too much time. What you see here is a pattern of wishing to intervene, but. And you have this one example after the other, and this is only a part of my collection of similar sentences. I wish I could intervene, but. The melancholic resignation that ensues from the failure to intervene, specifically in the face of injustice, is arguably nowhere more palpable than in his short text up in the gallery. Even more remarkable is the story's hidden suggestion that this very melancholy harbors a powerful, albeit utopian, vision. Kafka's Up in the Gallery, published in his collection Ein Landarzt in 1919, consists of two quasi-antithetical paragraphs. They correspond to each other in almost each of their components. The cast, the scenery, the action, but contrast in grammar, rhythm, atmosphere, and above all, though this time not symmetrically, in the paragraph's respective endings. So I will see if I should put it up. Can you see it, or is it too small?
We don't see images, Vivian.
Oh, I forgot to invite you, sorry.
Oh.
Can you see it?
Well, we only see the text of your paper.
Okay. Can you see it now?
No.
I do.
Really? You do? Okay. Does the audience see it? Maybe people can write in chat. I'm not
What
sure.
about this? Okay, you know what? I'll do it again.
Fine. I can see it, but don't worry about it. It seems like people
Can
can
you
see.
see it now?
We can.
Okay. So, the first paragraph describes a nightmarish scene in which a sickly female acrobat on a tottering horse is being chased ceaselessly around the ring by the whip-cracking ringmaster to the roar of the crowd, the orchestra and the ventilators, as if in a perpetual motion machine. In this dreary situation, the helpless female circus artist is oppressed by the powerful, ruthless director. Her suffering goes on without end in sight, as we are both told and can experience, in the constant use of the present perfect tense that conveys a continuing state rather than a completed action. In addition, the entire first paragraph is only barely articulated rhythmically by commas, creating an ever-growing sense of urgency halted by a dash, announcing an interruption. Out of this sense of urgency, a young man on the gallery might storm down the ring and respond to the witnessed injustice by shouting, "Halt!" to stop the spectacle and rescue the circus rider. This first scene is, however, kept in a subjunctive mode and thus presented as a hypothetical situation. The second paragraph indeed begins with a disclaimer of the factual status of the depicted scene. But since matters are not like this, reality as described in the second paragraph seems like the reverse of the previous one. We witness not a sickly, distressed rider, but a beautiful, confident professional and admired acrobat. Not a cruel, tyrannical ringmaster, but a figure who dotes on the rider like a loving grandfather, concerned for her safety. The rhythm here is very different from the first paragraph. Instead of one long sentence with commas, the second paragraph mostly comprises short, independent sentences with finite verbs. It is slower, separated by semicolons, ostensibly giving a much calmer, less hectic and urgent impression, suggesting order and harmony. In this scene, there is no need for a halt, and the rider does not need saving. She seems to be in active control of the situation, and the ringmaster now assumes a submissive and caring role. The story ends with a young man sinking into a dream born by the intoxication of the final chords of the military music. Unlike the first paragraph, which closes with a causal if-then, the second paragraph ends on a disturbing lack of logical consequence. And I quote, "Since matters are like this, meaning splendid and elated, the spectator in the gallery, quote, lays his face on the railing and sinking into the final march as in a deep dream, he weeps without knowing it." Why, given the beauty and harmony of the second version of the scene, is the spectator in the gallery weeping, and why without knowing it? Up in the gallery can be interpreted as a political parable. In such a reading, the first paragraph's oppressed circus acrobat, an early 20th century symbolic figure of the exploited and suffering other of mainstream society, is mistreated by the powers that be, quote, on and on into the ever unfolding gray future. The ongoing bleakness of these prospects, what Walter Benjamin calls homogeneous and empty time, can only be interrupted by an arrest or, as Benjamin writes in a note to the thesis on the philosophy of history, a pulling of the emergency brake. The first paragraph can be read as the perfect illustration of Benjamin's diagnosis of his time, that things continue like this is the catastrophe. The paragraph's subjunctive mode, ending on a negation of the scene's reality, and the antithetical, beautiful, indicative mode of the factual description of the scene in the second paragraph, disturb this reading. But an attempt to smooth out these obstacles can yield a coherent narrative along the following lines. If the world were to show itself in its absolute despondency, then the young visitor up in the gallery might, without hesitation, rush down into the ring and shout, "Halt!" a revolutionary act that would put an end to the ongoing torment and save the suffering creature. But since the world's misery is veiled by illusions, a revelation is required that would disclose the naked truth, that the stately rider we believe to see before us is in reality consumptive, that the devoted director is a tyrant, and that the ovations of the audience are preventing the potential savior from assessing the situation and putting an end to its infinite continuation. In the context of this reading, the relationship between the two parts can be explained without great difficulty. By the time we read the second paragraph, we have already experienced the oppressive scene of the first. The subsequent glorious version thus comes across as a wishful projection superimposed on the dismal scene witnessed before. We see how the spectator up in the gallery transformed the sickly artist into a beautiful lady, colored over the scene's grayness with a majestic red and white, reversed the power relations between the director and the artist, transformed the opportunistic orchestra into one which plays the stately closing chords, and convinced himself with relief that everything's fine and that no halt is needed. The young man, a textual identificatory marker that previously opened a space for the reader's intervention, instead lays his face on the railing and sinks into the music of the final march as in a deep dream. But wouldn't the reader at this point expect a reaction of relief? Why then the weeping? Well, the spectators weeping without knowing it, weint ohne es zu wissen, strikingly corresponds to Freud's description of melancholy, which, unlike in the work of mourning, the Trauerarbeit, remains unconscious and thus cannot be overcome. The spectator who lays his face on the railing, sinking into a dreamlike state, corresponds to what Freud diagnoses as the melancholic cessation of interest in the outer world. But why would this occur after the description of the beautiful circus scene? In one plausible explanation, this incongruous ending results from an unsuccessful self-delusion. In such a reading, the second paragraph conveys the process of repressing the first paragraph's dismal sight of suffering, misery, and oppression. Brushstroke after brushstroke, it paints over the grayness of the first scene, relieving the young man up in the gallery and the reader of the responsibility for the dreary reality just witnessed. However, the injustice evoked in the first paragraph, which has not been acted upon but merely repressed into the subjunctive and replaced by a phantasmatic, majestic, and harmonious scene in the second paragraph, leaves a residue of unconscious mourning. The young man's weeping is this remnant. What is conveyed in this way is a critique of glossing over a disturbing reality in order to insert it into a familiar, anticipated, and sedating order. Through the antithetical perspective of the two scenes, Kafka's text thus instructs the reader how manifest injustice and the concomitant suffering it causes is whitewashed in order to justify remaining up in the gallery indifferent and unmoved. In the story, the spectator's failure to have rushed down from the gallery seat, to have called out halt, to have intervened, remains as a tear about his missed opportunity to intervene, to shout halt, to perform the revolutionary act. The story would thus prefigure what Enzo Traverso, quoted in Nitzan's book, calls the present sense of melancholic defeat in political and social narratives that are not revolutions of the future, but the defeated revolutions of the past. But to end, on the textual level, there is, however, more to Kafka's story. Kafka, Benjamin writes, can only be understood as a figure who failed. And what, for Benjamin, he failed at was to transform literature into a doctrine. Yet, as Benjamin writes in a letter to Sholem, one might say, once he was certain of ultimately failing, he succeeded in everything he undertook, as in a dream. The locution of failure and success presupposes existing criteria and a binary system of values. This is precisely what is subverted in Benjamin's oxymoron of Kafka's successful failure. The ending of Up in the Gallery might be a case in point. Implicit in the ending of the story's otherwise rigorously antithetical structure, an utopia arises. It arises precisely out of the spectator's dreamlike melancholy that goes beyond the alternatives of a revolution here and its failure there. The spectator's weeping does not necessarily or not only signify a post-revolutionary melancholy, but a refusal to enter the arena on the available terms, to take part in the very discourses that stabilize the status quo in an either-or. While Kafka fails to develop a doctrine, his writing nonetheless interrupts the totalizing circle. This possibility is manifest in Kafka's starkest description of his dream associated with his own writing. To leap out of the murderer's row, action, contemplation, in German aus der Totschlägerreihe herausspringen, Tat, Beobachtung, Tat, Beobachtung. Kafka, in the same sentence, understands writing, his writing, as, quote, a higher form of contemplation that interrupts the sequential dichotomy between passively observing and actively intervening. Kafka describes the condition for such a leap out of a totalizing discourse of oppositions nowhere more succinctly than in a formidable paragraph in his diaries from November 20, 1911, that I'm rendering here in an abridged form. My repugnance, but it's much shorter than on my screen here. My repugnance for antithesis is certain. They make for thoroughness, fullness, completeness. But, and I'm cutting this, in truth, we have only driven our little idea around in a circle. They always end up, antithesis, always end up in the same finite mediocrity. They draw down antithesis to themselves. If they would only draw all of them down and forever. Kafka explains, these are my last lines, Kafka explains his repugnance for antithesis in terms that strikingly resemble the scenery of Up in the Gallery. Like the ringmaster driving the female acrobat, also called Die Kleine, the little one, in an endless circle. Antitheses are merely chasing our little idea around the circle, opposing glory to gloom, beauty to bleakness, and care to cruelty. Up in the gallery stages a near perfect antithesis. It, however, also provides its antidote. After staging a perfectly antithetical scenery, the ending escapes the inverse symmetry. Melancholy, like the weeping spectator at the end of the story, involves neither action nor contemplation and escapes the poles of antithesis. The non sequitur of the ending in the melancholy following a failed revolutionary act, an ending that has no reverse correspondence in the first scene, leaves the closed arena of, quote, thoroughness, fullness, completeness, and ultimately the conditions of the scene altogether, if only for the duration of our reading before the next antithesis inevitably circles into view. Drawing them all down and forever remains Kafka's unfulfillable dream of undoing the logic of oppositions once and for all. Although this remains an utopia, the melancholy ensuing from this failure disrupts and lays bare the oppressive ordering principle of oppositions and momentarily halts the endless circular ride into a gray future. This interruption might be the ultimate intervention literature can make in the circus of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. We will move to Rebecca Comay.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. I have to. I'm going to make some remarks, which are somewhat provocative in their intent, just to start a conversation. I have to admit, I myself was overcome with an enormous sense of sheepishness and cringing when I was asked to do this thing, but thank you anyway, Nitzan, and it's amazing to be here with you and Vivian and to listen to your presentations, to which this is really just a little sidebar. We hear a lot of whinging and cringing these days, but maybe not so much as we used to about melancholia of the left-wing sort. A complaining and a reclaiming of melancholia as a political attitude or affect. Melancholia is excoriated, is enjoined, is courted, is disdained, is ridiculed, is parodied and lampooned. And I'd like to think about some of the valences of this ambivalence in the present context. Melancholy itself is one of these recursive, self-reifying, self-ratifying, self-undermining, for all the same reasons, emotions, hard to hang on to, hard to give up, always turning into a kind of memorial or monument to itself, becoming the object of yearning, becoming personified, in fact, as an allegorical abstraction, inspiring treatises, odes, apostrophes, lyric effusions, producing an endless stream of images and images of images and ekphrastic invocations, resurrections, redescriptions, redesignations, resignifications, reinventions of images. I am thinking very specifically here, as you may be already guessing, of the way in which the so-called angel of history, Benjamin's completely strange ekphrasis of a clay painting, which is withdrawn from sight. And ekphrasis is itself a melancholy mode because it is engaging with an object which is always inherently lost and reclaimed. But always with this characteristic of overripeness, of fading, of fustiness, of pomposity, slightly nausea-inducing, always on the verge of turning into kitsch, becoming a memento, a souvenir, as in fact the Angelus Novus, has been for the longest time. I want to think about this, how this ambivalence, might work, and what it means for politics today. Melancholy itself, as Nitzan's presentation really showed us so well, it has always been shifting and oscillating, shape-shifting throughout history, from a humoral imbalance to an astrological misfortune, to demonic possession, a moral failing, a religious flailing, a crisis of authority, a psychic disorder, a neurochemical imbalance, just coming completely around back to the beginning of the circle with which I began. Robert Burton, already in 1621, in his Anatomy of Melancholy, referred half-jokingly to this panoply of shapes, but also panoply of symptoms, as a what he calls a tower of Babel, a confusion of tongues, hinting also that the very versatility of melancholia, its shape-shifting, proliferating, mutating aspect, its virtuosity and instability, was not only another symptom of melancholy itself. I mean, this kind of restless productivity is the flip flip side of its indolence, but an essential mark of its grandiosity, its hubris, its desire for achievement. I'm talking about the Tower of Babel, right? Its ostentation, its drive or insistence on recognition, its envy, its rivalry. There's something hubristic, unseemly, and punishable in this image, in this figure of melancholia as is itself a tower. The discourse of melancholia being drawn into melancholia itself as a kind of monument, in which the paradoxical pressures of our own sociability, I would extrapolate here, the need to speak, the need to be heard, the need to be seen, producing this confusion of languages and failure to communicate. So, marooned in contradictions, as melancholia has always been, flipping forever between genius and passivity, between achievement and paralysis, forever oscillating between a good version of itself, a heroic or productive or inspired version, and a paralytic, apathetic and defeatist version, between strength and weakness, between vice and virtue. Melancholia, my point is, has never been simply an analytic, descriptive, or even diagnostic category, but has always been freighted with this oddly normative pressure. I'm saying odd, if only because the norm itself is so diffuse and shifting. How much actually is enough? How long is too long? How much is too much? According to what standard? Why are we even measuring in the first place? What is the measure of this mismeasure? And you remember that the canonical faded emblem of melancholia is, of course, Dürer's endlessly reproduced engraving, which I'm only invoking ekphrastically because this is part of the point. It's an image that's just had been so seen that it's unseen. So it can be described now. But the pertinent feature I'm pointing to is it has to do with all these implements of measuring, which are half fallen from the hands of melancholia herself, and half ready to be used again. And this is the, I think in some ways the key confusion of this whole clutter of objects is these instruments of measurement which are being abandoned but not thrown away. This is I would suggest the weird normative, impossible normativity of melancholia itself. Why does melancholia itself provoke this need to take sides? Why does it split always into a good and a bad? Why does it do this to us? We know from Freud's very lackadaisical attempts, I think, in Mourning and Melancholia, how notoriously difficult and even pointless it is to draw the line between the pathological and the normal. And it's notable that Freud barely, or even, only half-heartedly really even bothers trying to distinguish between mourning, the mourning that works, and the melancholia that doesn't seem to work, gesturing to features which themselves are almost impossible to deny any sense of mourning if you take psychoanalysis seriously in the first place. There's something more, there's something beyond. Mourning goes on for too long, as if the unconscious obeys a clock in the first place, that the loss is unknown, as if there were such a thing as a loss that is known or could be known in the sense of conscious and explicit. What would that even be if you take psychoanalysis seriously? But also points to, something mystifying within melancholy itself, namely that it's never quite melancholy enough. He points to the peculiar, he's somewhat wicked here, but he's pointing to something real, the peculiar satisfactions in its dissatisfactions, this cocktail of self-abasement and self-aggrandizement, self-devaluation and self-promotion, what Freud calls, not without a real irony, an impoverishment of the ego on a grand scale. So there's this split. What I'm saying is the split between mourning and melancholia, which Freud really, I think, introduces only to throw away or blur, is actually a split internal to melancholia itself. I mean, this simultaneous overvaluation and denigration, both of the object and therefore of the self, this particular cocktail of idealization and disparagement, producing the perfect storm of disappointment, rage, self-flagellation, self-aggrandizement, self-promotion, but also, a possibility for self-reinvention. I'd like to shift the question somewhat to ask the question that I've been circling around, which is provoked actually by melancholia itself. It's two questions which are interlinked. One is, when did melancholia become a political category? And the second one, which is kind of the sort of evil twin of the first one, when did political discourse get so moralistic and moralizing about itself, that is to say, about politics? I don't mean simply, although this is far from irrelevant, when did we start feeling so awful, and when did things get so awful? When did the political landscape get so depressing and desperate? And I'm not talking only about whether melancholia makes for a good or bad politics, or just about the way in which it's been politicized, that is to say, hijacked to dubious agendas of all sorts. But when I ask, when does melancholia become a political category, I actually mean why. Why does melancholia become a political category in the first place? The discourse and what happens when it does so. It's aggravating and notable, but for that reason worth thinking about, that the discourse of and around and within melancholia itself it marks the place where when introduced into politics, is the place where political discourse can become insufferably moralizing, admonitory, exhortatory, aestheticizing, hyperbolic, ritualistic, either a litany of lost possibilities, or what it's really no better, or maybe even no different, flat-footed denunciations of melancholy as being somehow defeatist and disengaged and unworthy. So when I ask when does this happen, I don't really mean what year, because partly because there are several years. That is to say, the problem keeps repeating itself. If I had to hazard a recent date, the most recent iteration of this problem, I would reckon roughly sometime post-Cold War, post-wall, pre-crash, in that particular interregnum, post-1989, pre-2008, say, or maybe it was the 1970s or whenever it was when this epoch opened up of seemingly unimpeded and irresistible the neoliberal capitalism and the evisceration of class-based politics in particular, where the left starts confronting a ruined landscape of seemingly unfulfilled promises and utopian visions from the early part of the century, not to speak of the actual literal heaps of toxic waste that have been ruining the planet forever. And so Traverso, in the book that Nitzan already and Vivian already alluded to, comments on the turn to trauma discourse inside and outside the academy. I think he's thinking about the 90s in particular, when it became a thing, when trauma became a thing and when memory became a thing, an academic specialty, an institutional affair, a bureaucratic business, how everyone fell in love with melancholy, with memory and trauma at a certain point. He speaks a little rudely or meanly, or in any case, funnily, of a kind of staginess. Enter memory, exit politics, he says. This is the moment when the political imagination becomes atrophied and turns into a kind of aesthetic or ethical preoccupation, and memory becomes the muse which fills the gap left by the retreat of class politics and of class itself, specifically as an analytic and political and pragmatic category. That is to say, revolution. This is when left-wing melancholy also became, not for the first time, but for the most recent time, a term of abuse, as reactive, as reactionary, as sentimental, and ultimately as oxymoronic. Either it's insufficiently left, or it's insufficiently melancholic, or it's both. So we're familiar with some harangues from the liberal left which would see in leftist melancholia a failure to mourn, that is to say, to let go of or to acknowledge the the real loss as a concrete actuality or possibility of class-based politics. So a kind of fixation on a lost cause, call it class struggle, call it revolution, which speaks of a fetishistic attachment to anachronism and of a disengagement with the demands of the present. So that's the attack from the liberal left. There's also an objection from a harder left, which might amount to the same thing, namely that the problem with left-wing melancholy is that it's not that it's too melancholy, or that it hasn't mourned or acknowledged that moment has gone, the moment of revolution. So let's, that model and that moment of revolution. So let's reinvent ourselves, but that it's not melancholy enough. It's not tenacious enough, despite or because of the fetishization of the missed opportunity of revolution, the reification of revolution itself as a substitute, elision, and diversion of actual revolutionary practice. With that comes a too easy, this is why it's not melancholic enough, a too easy relinquishing of the idea of communism, or what Jody Dean calls the communist horizon, as a regulative idea, and as something which should not have been let go of so easily. So left-wing melancholy, in this sense, is a kind of oxymoron. The two terms are somewhat at odds. Now, the term itself is the oxymoronic term is itself an illusion, as we all know, as we've already heard, to Walter Benjamin's excoriating essay on the subject. He'd introduced the term in 1931 as a term of use. He was referring to the moroseness and apathy of intellectuals, certain intellectuals, certain writers, whose pathos was a smokescreen which served to obscure their own class affiliations, and specifically to disavow the conditions of their own literary production. So writers, maybe are tempted to do this. I mean, this is something which maybe we're all tempted to do in this business. But this is the left-wing melancholy that he diagnosis in 1931 is a melancholy of class. I mean, it's really a refusal to acknowledge. It's a retreat from any class-based analysis or self-positioning, and as such, it's a kind of idle, fatigued mood that serves ultimately to embellish a real political impotence in the present. So left-wing, what he calls left-wing melancholy, is one kind of sadness. It joins the ranks of the other sadnesses, the apathy of the historicist, described in the theses on history, the romantic ruin gazing, what he calls in the Arcades project, referring to the kind of ennui, the atmosphere of Second Empire Paris, as I'm quoting him, spiritually barren, petty bourgeois discontent. These are all affects that, and this is the sticking point, that he will never stop rebuking, but not in the name of good cheer or optimism, of course, but rather in the name of another kind of, sorry, I just got to turn off my phone here. So another kind of Okay, another kind of more rigorous, more intransigent, more revolutionary, in fact, melancholy, which we have, come to we've come to associate, for better or worse, with the backwards gaze of the angel of history. But in introducing this this term of left-wing melancholy, I'm moving backwards for a reason. I mean, not because you need a historical genealogy, but just because I think it might be useful, actually. Benjamin is already resurrecting a concept worried about and forged by Marx and Engels, for whom arguably left-wing melancholy is coincident with the reification of the left wing itself. I'm referring to the so-called left Hegelianism, from which, Marx in particular, but also Engels with him, never cease to try to, from whom Marx and Engels never ceased to try to disentangle themselves. It was Engels, actually, who coined the snarl word Deutsche Misere, where in the 1850s, in the 1840s, where the French loan word misère actually underscores that it's introduced only to underscore that the misery is all too German. He's specifically referring to a failure or blockage of translation, of something that does not make it through. German misery in the pre-March desert of the 1840s is precisely the failure to be French, the failure to have had a homegrown revolution, a failure to modernize, a failure to catch up. The predicament that Marx describes so amazingly in his preface to, in his 1843 preface to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, that Germany finds itself in this peculiar situation after Waterloo of suffering the loss of something that was never theirs to possess in the first place. This is what it means to suffer the restoration without actually having had a revolution from which to be restored. So it's pure counter-revolution in the absence of any revolution.
Rebecca, excuse me, I'm gonna need to, we almost out of time, so.
Okay, great. I haven't even gotten to my point, so that's fine. Okay, I'll stop, actually. Well, I'll only say that, I'll only say two things. One of them is, how this, how Marx characterizes this precisely as this weird ritual of a mourning, a funeral that takes place without a corpse to bury. He says the Germans kept company with freedom only once, on the day of its own burial. That's the only time it encounters freedom, in the moment of counter-revolution. My second point, which is just too large to even begin to embark on, is that the problematic is formalized really, the problematic and the paradox is formalized really in Hegel, who really, it shows in absolutely rigorous detail how an event can be reified as a lost object, how losing itself can get reified as a possession, and how history itself can be or has become contingently, but also structurally, the record of such reifications. At the very least, and I'll close here, this forces us to revise the picture of Hegel and of Hegelian Marxism, a picture perpetrated, of course, by Hegel and by Marx a lot of the time, as an ideologue of progressive, universal history in an affirmative and possibly apologetic mode or mood. Thanks. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you. It's just fantastic. So I encourage the audience, we don't have a long time, we only have 10 minutes, but please do write your questions in the Q&A box and I will read them. And maybe I'll just start off. And we heard a few papers on different manifestations of melancholy. And I think one of the difficulties or the challenges is we talk about many different things. We talk about the philosophical term, a theoretical term, a literary term, and in the political term. And in your case, Nitzan, you were talking about the connection between the literary and the political. And I'm wondering, although I think, Rebecca, you made a very convincing case for the instability of the term altogether, but if in a utopian world where we could think about melancholy as something semi-stable, something that is related to the repression of some sort, repression of loss and so on, can we imagine still melancholy spurring or triggering some kind of leftist politics, maybe that's not revolutionary, that's pragmatic, or and maybe this goes to what you were talking about, I think, Vivian, a little bit. Can we imagine a left-wing politics that's non-binary and that is derived or connected to melancholy?
Maybe I could answer. Although this might have to be seen in a frame of Maurice Blanchot's Hélas, rien qu'un livre, nothing but in a book. But I think that Kafka does point somewhere in this story to the possibility that melancholy can be, in German, it would be called ein Statthalter der Utopie, which is how Adorno called art altogether, or his kind of art. That it does indeed, although it mourns not having acted, or it mourns a failed revolution, the memory of the possibility is kept. So I think it is kept as something that did not happen, that has not been written, but that is there somewhere on the horizon as a regulative ideal, or as just something that is not, that has not disappeared. So in the meantime, in post-revolutionary times, it does capture something and keeps it, maybe not safe, but it does keep it somewhere, yes.
Somebody else want to answer?
Maybe, Justin, this is a very brief response. I think we should take more questions from the audience. By the way, you can see the lightning around me here. It's pretty stormy now. I was thinking about both Vivian's and Rebecca's comments, and the fact that we have thinkers who think about it in a non-binary way, right? And I'm thinking specifically, for instance, about Roberto Esposito's discussion about melancholy as a fullness of loss or region, right? Or marking the place into which we don't know how to go. So there is a sense of something that actually extends beyond the political mission, if you like, Rebecca, or beyond a certain task, beyond a certain, object, even when it's a critical one, even if it's a revolutionary one, that is thinking with, but also out of the specific political translation.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have it's a huge question, and I would just want to say one thing, because of course respecting the theological ban on images that both Marx and Benjamin and Adorno and Hegel impose on us, that how could we, and what would be the point of in any case imagining what a post-revolutionary utopian melancholia would look like? I mean, because any imagination would just be some version of what we already know. What I would venture to want to think about over and over the question of whether binarism itself is the problem is the possibility of a non-moralistic or non-moralizing kind of melancholia. That would be, to my mind, a vindication of the political as a domain beyond morality. That is to say, a public good, not something that is inevitably privatized as a matter of ethical, moral decision. So,
great. I guess we'll take one or two questions. This is a question for Rebecca. An attendee is asking you to go further in articulating the point you made of Hegel's idea of the event as object. And I don't know if you can do that in 2 minutes, but that's what you have.
Yeah. Oh, so well, so the event question for Hegel as to all his people was the French Revolution, which was essentially registered as not German or as un-German for better or worse. And Hegel was one of the few, to his credit, to step away from the then liberal doxa, elaborated, most fulsomely by Kant, I suppose, but by all his descendants, that somehow this was Germany's advantage. Somehow by not being French, they could have their revolution without having to actually have a revolution. That they could experience it precisely in an ethical, moral, philosophical, aesthetic, literary dimension. So this is the sort of the idea that an upheaval, a material upheaval, a bloody material upheaval could be refunctioned or sublimated as a spiritual event. And this is the historical context in which Hegel's own conceptual framework really tries to show, I think, again and again, how it's partly about how action itself gets reified, turned into an object. Call it substance, call it a thing, how it gets stabilized, and the way in which this legitimates and actually freezes an existing present to the present's discredit.
I have to stop you again. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
We really have like two more minutes. Maybe you can type an answer to the reader, to the attendee. And I guess maybe last question too. I mean, somebody wrote a question: is melancholy necessary? But I don't know if you want to get into that. But I think this is an interesting question for Nitzan about Palestinians and and Zarchi's melancholia, and I think the melancholia of settlers, which I think in your book you speak. And many other people speak about the loss of the diaspora and the loss of their families and so on in the Holocaust, but also maybe what is being repressed. I think, if I may rephrase this question, is exactly what is the violence to the Palestinians. And maybe that's the source of the melancholy.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the question. This is one of the issues that were hardest for me to deal with. I'm writing as a historian and writing as an intellectual historian, and that means I'm trying to consider the way people use language in the context in which they live. And that means speaking about, for instance, melancholy for one, that I need to understand melancholy in the way it's being discussed in 1920 or 1930, or the mindset behind that. Now, one of the ways I see as you know, being accountable to my historical profession is actually to not judge, or at least not judge while I try to understand, analyze my protagonists, is to try and work with their own language. And that means that when my protagonists are discussing or ignoring the existence of Palestinians, I need to find a way to deal with that while not betraying as if their own language. Yeah. So I'm trying as a historian to actually project this absence, but without calling it a name, if they didn't, right? And that's a very hard thing to do. It means, in literary terms, Vivian could attest to that, using in some ways the free indirect discourse. And that's a really hard thing to do, because then you're being accused, or you're being seen as someone who's empathizing with your protagonist, even when your protagonist is a very problematic figure. You know, I wrote about Nazis, I wrote about fascists, and I tried to do the same thing, to try and understand their views of language. So to answer directly to the question, I think many of the settlers discuss the Palestinian or the Arabic population, calling it in their own names. They're using their own language to try and actually deal with the problem of existence or absence, or the emptiness of the land, as they see that again. I'm trying to follow that as a historian, and I'm trying to try and point out where the absence testifies for what I would like to see, but don't very often, but without, again, judging it from the privilege of anachronism, right? And that's a really hard, stylistically, a very hard thing to do, and trying to avoid, as Rebecca said, you know, moralism or crude judgment. So I hope that answers the question. It's a really huge question. And of course, we have, on the other hand, really, really amazing Palestinian authors and poets who talk specifically about melancholy in their own language and attest to their relation to their own day and historical circumstances. So there's a lot to explore that. And that may be an answer to, is melancholy necessary as well in some ways. I don't know if it's necessary. I know that it's there, you know, like Mount Everest. It was there when the people were writing about, wrote about their reality. And it's in some ways, you know, what we echo now, what we do in our language, I think echoes, reverberates those voices as well in their language.
Thank you so much. I think this is actually a great way to end this panel. Thank you, Rebecca, Nitzan, and Vivian. And thank you all for joining us. And I assume this will be recorded and put on the Humanities website. And so those of you who missed it can watch it. Thank you very much.